Hey listeners, Mallory Willsea here, Chief Producer of the Enrollify Network. I get the privilege of working alongside all of our creators at Enrollify, but I wanted to take just a quick moment to tell you about why I love the Talking Tactics podcast hosted by Diana Kibbolds. Every other Tuesday, Day drops a new episode where she focuses on a single tactic that moved the needle on any enrollment metric, from inquiries and booth visitors to apps completed and deposits, even registrations, you name it. The catch? The tactic had to be done with limited resources, either by a single person or a small but mighty team, or limited time, or maybe without a lot of money. The podcast format is fun and engaging, and it's just different from the more traditional 60-minute interview style shows. If you work in enrollment management or marketing, be sure to give Day's show a listen. You can subscribe to the show by visiting podcast.enrollify.org or just search Talking Tactics wherever you get your podcasts.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about. Wait!
Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Welcome to After Further Consideration, a special 5-part DEI-focused pulse check series brought to you by Enrollify and Element 451. I'm Dr. Cody Nielsen, Executive Director of Convergence Strategies, independent scholar, and adjunct faculty throughout the United States.
And I'm Dr. Tomika Ferguson, Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and Inclusive Excellence and Assistant Professor in the School of Education at Virginia Commonwealth University. We're sitting down with seasoned change leaders for candid chats about responsive leadership, addressing campus crises, navigating institutional shifts, and fostering sustainable change, all through the lens of equity and inclusion.
Each episode dives into real-life challenges, lessons learned, and the innovative solutions some of the brightest minds have developed to tackle these complex issues.
Our goal is to help you drive positive and inclusive change in your campus. Now, let's jump into today's episode.
Today, our guest is Dr. Tomika Ferguson.
Oh, and also Dr. Cody Nielsen.
We are the guests today. We decided to conclude our beginning 5-part intro series by doing a conversation amongst ourselves because we came into the conversation around equity and inclusive leadership as well. And so we wanted to spend the time this morning talking with you about what we do. So, Tomika, everybody gets that introduction from you talking about your work at VCU. And everybody can, LinkedIn you. But I want to know about you. We've known each other for almost 8 years now, it seems.
Wow.
Yeah, crazy enough.
That went by so fast.
Well, COVID and all. But I want to know more about you. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk with each other. We're going to hear about each other's stories a little bit. And I want to sort of start by asking you, how did you get where you are today at VCU?
So I just want to say the awkwardness of interviewing each other is going to come out.
Oh, yes.
But, when I start thinking about how I get here today, there is the professional story that I'll center today. So I am a first-generation college student. I'm also a former college athlete. And I always talk about that, not just because I study sports and I am supporting the experiences of college athletes through not only the lens of equity and inclusion, but also on developmental leadership skills. But it was a defining moment for me. Coming from mathematics, going to the University of Virginia as a walk-on track and field athlete, I had to deal with so many different challenges. I had to deal with, one, being from a low-income household. How do I afford college and all of the sacrifices that came with that? Being a walk-on track and field athlete, feeling inadequate, not always knowing if I was doing the right thing, learning how to be excellent at a Division I institution, and also with the competitiveness of being a D1 athlete, but also just navigating undergrad as someone who didn't know what they always wanted to do. And so I talk about that because it's important to know that it's always been this theme of, investigation and inquiry and curiosity, and really overcoming some of those systemic challenges that folks deal with, that we work with now. Like the same folks that I'm teaching and researching and studying, I'm definitely having a connection with them based on my undergrad experience. And so once I went to graduate school at Indiana University in Bloomington, shout out the Hoosiers, I was able to work from being an administrator at James Madison University, working in community engagement, youth and workforce development programs, and transitioning to being a professor and assistant dean at VCU. And along that way were all of these amazing people and these experiences in college access and in housing and working in the community, in rural communities, and being able to really transition that to being a researcher. And VCU gave this opportunity to become an assistant dean, mostly just because of the growth of our student population. And so I was able to have an excellent mentor and former dean, Andrew Dare, who provided me with an opportunity and saw a promise in me, as did my other colleagues, to be able to take on the role as an assistant dean. My PhD is in higher ed administration. My work is in cultural studies. It's in equity, it's in inclusion, it's in race, it's in gender. And so leading as the assistant dean for student affairs and inclusive excellence seemed like the most obvious next step in my career, while also maintaining myself as an assistant professor. And so I would say that how I got here really is a series of overcoming the challenges that so many folks who are marginalized and minoritized face in higher ed. And then education was this pathway for not only learning how to study and have the scholarly approach to solving
Mhm.
problems, but also navigating some of the very systems that students face. I've been able to gain the ability to challenge those policies and rewrite them at times and find ways to grow in them. And so now in this position as, being a tenure track professor, being an assistant dean, having this hybrid role, it's the best of both worlds for me because I get to help and I get to study. It's to create and I get to, I think, empower people. And so it's a great space to be in.
I love like sort of learning about that sort of balance between the two, between that sort of scholar practitioner role. And I think that's such a critical piece for us. I feel like there's such a dividing line in the field right now
Hmm.
where people like lose that. They're either immersed in the scholarship, and we're often saying, well, do you have the practical experience on the ground? And I love your
Hmm.
ability to like sort of straddle those lines.
Well, I laugh because, in a lot of our conversations, we talk about the theory to practice, but we
Yeah.
never talk about practice to theory. And I would say sometimes in my administrative hat, I am informed by a lot of scholarship, but it's always
Mhm.
like, is the scholarship applicable? Like, can I, with all of the things that I have to navigate as an administrator, thinking about enrollment and budgets and thinking about the academic curriculum and thinking about graduation rates and the DEI attacks, thinking about students graduating to become teachers and the different licensure requirements they have, like thinking about all of those compounding issues that are involved in every decision that I have to weigh out with my colleagues and with my team as a leader. Sometimes the theory informs the thinking, but it's not always possible in practice. And it makes me think about the work that you do also as a leader. And, when you introduce yourself and you're like, I lead convergence strategies, you too have this story of hybridity that I think
Yeah.
is phenomenal. So, Cody, how did you get to where you are today?
Okay, well, I can share that, and I'm going to tell I'm going to tell the listeners over here to hold what you just said because I'm going to want to come back to that sort of what you were just talking to. Okay, so I it's my story is so weird. As a straight white cishet individual, I grew up in Iowa, where I always like to tell people that diversity is being Lutheran or being Catholic. Like that's legitimately about the best diversity conversation that we get. And I went to the University of Northern Iowa. I studied social work and psychology, and I had no plans to go into higher education. And I send this as a warning signal every time I talk to folks. I was a first generation college student. I had a heart for doing like sort of the human and social services side. And I thought I was going to end up doing public policy and going to law school. And I still think about those days and the thought about what that would look like. And the problem was is that nobody introduced me to the field of student affairs at all. I was really intrigued by working in higher education throughout college. I had such a wonderful college experience. High school had been rough for me. College was a liberating experience in so many ways. And what happened for me is that no one gave me that introduction. And so I ended up going down this different path, getting a master's in mental health counseling, and then crazy enough, getting a master's in divinity. And the reason was because I was concerned around issues related to religious equity on college campuses and the impacts of that. But no one had sort of introduced a sort of student affairs lens for me. So it was actually after seminary and actually after I had spent 3 years in Washington, D.C., working at places like American University while I was in grad school, that I moved to the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities and started seeing the repercussions of our sort of failures in higher education to look at religious concerns, sort of looking at it through that intersectional lens around race, gender, sexuality, and all the sorts. Religion was sort of placed over on the side. And of course, we've historically heard the sort of separation of church and state narratives and things like this. That's a whole nother episode and a whole conversation around the work that I do. But once I determined that places that I worked at and other institutions that I was looking at across the country and even across Canada were failing to address issues around this, I just fell into the sort of like, I have to get my PhD. And I always accredit my friends who sort of took me aside and said that you need to get your PhD in higher ed, you need to pivot your career as being that sort of shift. And there's a sort of legendary, now retired guy at Iowa State University named Larry Ebbers, who is one of the sort of like pillars of the field of higher ed, who essentially brought me down to Ames, told me about the program and why I needed to get my PhD at Iowa State. And it was pretty easily that I got brought into the program and started that in 2015. My whole last 10 years then has been a sort of exploration about how equity-based concerns need to insert this area of identity and how it fits with a sort of decolonial framework in higher ed. And so I fell in love with the sort of practitioner side. And then in my last year of my doctorate in 2019, I started to fall in love with the idea of doing exactly what you're talking about, splitting that idea, that sort of scholar practitioner role, wanting to write more, wanting to be in the classroom more, wanting to be able to grow in my teaching endeavors. And luckily enough, through a number of colleagues, after I graduated in the midst of COVID, I had landed a directorate position, so an administrative position, but I also was seeking out faculty and opportunities, and that's how I landed at the schools that I've landed at. Now, I'm still on the tenure track faculty search. I think that's the end goal for me, is the sort of tenure track faculty search that straddles the line of my work as a consultant and a work as somebody who tries to put that theory to practice. But I will tell you, going back to your point about that sort of idea that the practitioner has to put practice into theory, one of the things that's really intriguing to me about that is that I so agree with is how little I feel like this field gives space for the practitioner to create grounded theory. The grounded theory is coming so much from a sort of heady scholarly side, and I think sometimes it is missing what could be right in front of us. And I think as somebody who has spent their career trying to move into the academic, sort of tenure line piece, I'm like, right there is a practitioner to the scholar lens. And I will be honest, I have been surprised that the field is not more populated with practitioners who later turn into full-time scholars.
So one, you do have this intriguing story of navigating this identity-driven professional pursuit,
Yep.
right? It's, I want to help, so let me get this degree. And I'm
Yep.
interested and passionate about my upbringing and my religious upbringing, so let me get this degree. I will say that you are definitely overqualified with all these degrees, but that's a story for another day. But, one of the things that when you and I were talking about starting this 5-part DEI series,
Yeah.
really getting into after further consideration, one of the things that we wrestled with was, how can leadership be responsive,
Yep.
right? Not having conversations about what could happen, but talking to these change leaders that have overcome crisis, how they navigate shifts, because it's not just COVID that's caused shifts, right? We have
Right.
post-recession, presidencies and political changes that have happened, October 7th, and things that are happening with wars over in Europe. And so we tend to see all these challenges, and then the challenges that are not talking about that are also affecting folks,
Yeah.
wars that are happening and not even being highlighted within like the continent of Africa,
Yep.
and internal wars that are not just related to books that students read.
Yep.
There's so much crisis happening at the same time that it's hard to identify one. And one of the things that I've pulled out from that, based on what you just said, is it's the navigation piece of the identity of the individual
Yep.
and their experience and how they bring that to the field as we are preparing a constant generation of folks who have to not only navigate these as professionals, but make decisions that can be critical to how the students and their colleagues are really facing these crises, because student identity matters, but it is also impacted by the policy or lack thereof. And so I think one of the things I'm intrigued by is when you work with the different campuses and professionals who you've engaged with, what are some of the things that are part of your conversations in helping them to identify what their specific need is, and how do you lean into the theory and the work in our field to do that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I feel like I want to ask you the same thing because you do some of this work too. One of the things that I often ask folks is, and I would say this is maybe a little bit beyond the scope of what most folks working in the field would do, is I think we're very reactionary. It's exactly what you're talking about. We react to things, but we're not proactive. And I always like to say fire insurance is more expensive when the building is already on fire. So it's got to be like, how do we think ahead of ourselves? So when I'm asking folks and I'm thinking through conversations and thinking through needs with folks, my response is always, what's the bigger picture? Like, what's the larger scope of what's happening? So, for example, Israel and Palestine and what has come up and what has played out this year, there's a lot of folks that I've talked with who have been responsive of like, how do we get people to have, better conversations and things like this? And my response has been, have you provided like what kind of systemic and structural things have you already put in place that allow students to feel safe and have a sense of belonging? And those are the conversations that I think are harder to have, because when we are not dealing with one crisis, it feels like we're dealing with another crisis. And so allowing that conversation with folks on the ground to see the bigger picture requires them to not always be in, firefighter mode.
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue that is actually one of our great threats in this field toward exhaustion and the lack of morale. We can't be visionary if the only thing that we're allowed to do is to respond to the immediate crisis. And that response from the crisis needs to later be able to be encalcified. That's the whole point of why we started this podcast too, is to take those experiences, to reflect back on them, and to proceed forward, but not to be able, like, reactionary momentum says that you solve the crisis and it's a simple crisis that's just a simple single site issue, and then you move on to the next crisis. Real revolutionary leadership is being willing to recognize you're in the crisis. That's a part of the larger scope of what we're trying to get toward. And once that crisis is resolved, we reflect back on it, and we take that and we use that to continually set the next piece of road that's 5, 6, 7 years down the road that we're building towards, so that we are not seeing ourselves only reacting, but being proactive in our visioning.
Hey there, it's Mallory, Chief Strategist of Enrollify. Higher ed is facing a leadership crisis. The demands on today's college and university leaders are skyrocketing, and talent is leaving the industry at an unprecedented rate. New leaders like you are emerging, but no one is getting the proper training to be successful. Well, Enrollify is here to change that. Our new course, Lessons in Leadership, taught by Dr. Carrie Phillips, will prepare you to be a confident, empathetic, and effective leader. From systems thinking to adaptive leadership, building culture to handling difficult decisions, this comprehensive online course is perfect for new and aspiring leaders. Don't wait. The course starts September 9th, and for a lucky group of 26 students, we have the option to add interactive sessions with Dr. Phillips for personalized guidance. Visit Enrollify.org to learn more.
But it's guiding folks, not just as a consultant
Yeah.
or just in our writing, but it's really gathering people around their own awareness of where they're located, not just where they want to be or where they think that they are.
Yeah.
And that's really difficult. I think in a classroom setting, when we teach, we're trying to help students gain awareness through reading, grow your knowledge. Where are you situated with what you're reading? How does this, not only this theory, but how does the outcome of these incredible studies grow you from your own thinking? I remember in graduate school, I had a professor who I will not name, who challenged me in thinking that you can't just bring the singular idea based on your lived experience into leadership spaces or even into critiquing what happens. Because when you do that, it's a limited pathway towards addressing the challenge. And in what you said that is really meaningful to me, and I think connects with some of the things that I believe, is that being a critically reflective leader involves taking the time and scheduling and focusing and seeing the benefit of reflection and then being okay with processing it. Um, One of the challenges that I faced, as a leader is not always having the time to reflect. And there might be people on here who are listening who are like, yeah, because we're going from one thing to another. Not everything's a crisis, right? It's just a lot of decisions. It's the state standards, it's the accreditation, it's the challenges of retaining faculty and staff, it's the ongoing training, it's the continuous momentum of adjusting to student challenges, the growing mental health. Like for my role, I lead an amazing team of folks who are working with recruitment and enrollment, who are working with retention and advising, who are working with, supporting teacher education and the clinical licensure experience. And everything is different all the time because the way that we used to do stuff doesn't function that way anymore. And so for me, I have to force myself at times to reflect because if I don't, I lead from a past season, and the new challenges that I'm facing, while they aren't crises, they require like me to get over, process, and take what I need from what was happening previously to apply it. And when I think about the defining moments in my career, I would say that there was one defining moment that I had, probably when I was the interim assistant dean. So this is before I was fully in the role. It was in 2020 I started the role, and everybody was virtual and everybody was exhausted. And we had students, similar to what happened across the country, write a letter of protest and ask us to respond to a lot of critical things. And it was in the conversation as being in the role less than 90 days. And hey, so here's a responsibility, DEI related, whatever you want to say, you should be able to do it. When I started reflecting and talking to the students, what I realized was that what I thought my perspective was as an assistant professor and what I was learning that I had to learn as an assistant dean, there was a significant gap of knowledge. My students revealed to me so many issues and problems that had been discussed at faculty meetings, that had a task force, that had this, and they had promises and no follow through. It wasn't until I sat down and created that plan of response that I revisited every year to make sure that we're still committing to it. But it's taken the time to schedule that reflection. Are we still adhering to what we said? And the defining moment for me was that I didn't realize the depth of thinking and reflection and the undoing of whiteness, the undoing of assumptions and bias and lack of training and, you know, just ego. There's so much that was there that has taken me a long time to undo that as a leader, even within the spaces and within myself. And so I call that a defining moment that made me think about my leadership is because I can't lead from what I think they need. I have to lead from what they say they need, what the data also says that we can do, and then be committed to being authentic and following through with that leadership. And so it's not like I'm taking these anecdotal experiences and then, just like I'm throwing an idea against the wall and whatever sticks I go with, but thinking through it in a way that they can see that I'm authentic. And when I can't do something and I'm unable, or the system that I'm working within in higher ed doesn't allow me to, I can still think of a pathway in order to get as much as I can to respond to their needs. But it's also learning my capacity and the limitations that I have. And that's why I think what you said is so powerful, because reflection helps us to respond to the things that we overcome more proactively, to where we're not just stuck in doing the same thing. We have this desire to continue to grow while also being informed
Mhm.
by the varied amounts of scholarships we have access to.
Yeah. No, I agree with you because, I think that there are like defining moments that are out there that just that shift the way in which you think about things. And I feel like there have been a couple of times in my career where um, I've shifted locations and I've seen what I thought were parallels between like existing situations and occurrences. And you're like, oh, the familiarity is there. And I feel like in both of those situations, I've had to step back and say, but it's a different individual experience. And each campus and each system is like applying its own individual lens. And so the ability to be able to read the room, if you will, and I know that sounds really cliche, but stepping back and to being able to like pivot and just, yeah, the old friends line, just pivot, pivot, pivot in order to get what you need done. But like you're saying, like it just seems like sometimes the students or the folks that you're working in front of can identify what the needs are. And the question is, how do we get there? And how do we make sure we follow through? And how, when it gets tough, do we learn how to change our modality? But what is it, the input of all of these like crises, all of these circumstances that we've had before? Like we need to keep moving into new directions, but there's a similar tone, but we're going to have to find a different way.
So, question as a follow up, and this
Yeah.
really is going to lean into some of the decisions that you shared earlier. Um, when you start thinking about, you were in seminary, you also have this master's in health counseling. How do you use the knowledge that you've gained to take care of yourself, so that when you're dealing with a lot of these heavy things as a person who helps so many people, especially from an intersectional lens, identifying, the cis, het, all of that, how do you utilize that to help yourself while you're helping other people?
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging question. And it's mostly because, and I know you pretty well, but I can't be inside your head. But I will tell you is that for me, I am a very ambitious, driven human being. Yeah, I think we have that similar tone, Tamika. And I think that the challenge for me is taking care of myself is sometimes acknowledging that you can't do everything in one day and that you can't
Hmm.
fix every problem. And I'll tell you, I don't like that. My therapist and I like would have conversations about that. And I think the biggest way of taking care of myself, really, when it comes down to it, is being able to say, okay, what can I solve? What can I help with? And then what do
Hmm.
I keep striving toward? And it's like, like you keep building the momentum, but there's always going to be needs. Like, and so I have to step back and take care of myself because if I'm not taking care of myself, like I'm not there. So I try to make sure I keep up on my exercise, my running. I try to make sure that I take my weekends off and that I don't sit in front of the computer all the time, even though I probably should be writing, which is what the academic mindset has told me I should be writing. Uh, but I mean, like, what do you do? Like, how the heck do you manage this? Because I think that's one of the great fears about this field long term is that we are serving so many people. There is
Hmm.
always a crisis. And I can give another example of that at another time about how I've illustrated that. But there's always something to be done. What are you doing to take care of yourself?
So this has been a focus of mine for probably the past 2 years because I've hit burnout a couple of times, and it hasn't been. I mean, it's not just like burnout to where I have writer's block or like I'm just really tired. I lose my creativity. I am unable to even forget writing. I can't even conceptualize and start reading. I can't even think through. It's like a fog. So I started thinking that I have to stop centering my work and I have to start centering the things that are more of like my passion strengths, right? So I do identify as a Christian, and I will say that my faith is an area that I go to at times because it helps me to think better. So that's something, and I'm not always vocal about that, right? But I think in my relationship with you and knowing your work, our religious and spiritual identity matters so much. So that's a part of just having me have some balance. I would also say, like, I'm a mom, and being a mom of like a really cool kid, it allows me to like do all of the random things. Like I'm gonna go ride the roller coasters, right? Seeing everything new through her eyes makes everything that even though I've experienced it already, it makes it more fun. So we find joy, whether that's candle making or going to the pool or just hopping on a plane and going somewhere to explore somewhere from a different perspective. My family, spending a lot of time with them, and I love Korean TV, K dramas. So I love K dramas. Like one, I'm reading I'm reading all of the translation on there and the captions, and I can't text on my phone because I got to read. So it actually allows me to be isolated and just focus in on one thing, which is hilarious. But I love eating too. Which means I also have to love working out. So, it depends on the season, but for me, it's giving myself the capacity to grow and consider multiple things depending on what the burnout feels like. If it's burnout that I just can drop everything, I'm going to use my PTO. I'm going to take the time off. But I do think that we have to be open to the fact that it looks different for everyone. And when we start thinking about equity and inclusion, we can't do presentations for folks and have these conversations about, you know, refraining from burnout means that you find joy in your work. That's a part of it, but you're still working, right? And that you want to maybe consider modality and work from home and hybridity. Yeah, but I'm still working. Those sometimes our burnout strategies, even with our best interests at heart, assuming positive intent, are still centering work as the space to fight the burnout that work might cause. And so I think we need to talk more about like who are you really and how can you center yourself and not just managing the things that give you stress. How do you really just have a holistic approach? And that's something that I've learned from you, is that it's okay to identify in so many different spaces in so many different ways, as long as we make meaning of it and apply it from a meaningful perspective.
I think that what you just said is really powerful. I'm thinking about this and all of our listeners that are like managers and are overseeing people, like, how do we stop driving people to perform or to get tasks completed? Because again, going back to the sort of reactionary thing, how do we sit down? How do we get creative? How do we spend time getting to know another? And yes, some of us that are listening are like, my friends are not my colleagues, like, and that's fine. And maybe that's there. But I think that there's a level of humanizing that we need to come back to in this field, a level in which we acknowledge, just try to do what you can do, bring your authentic self, bring the vision, the lived experiences that you have. Everybody, I think about that in hiring situations. We're so bad, we hire people for fit, such a racialized, colonized like structure.
That's a whole podcast.
That's a whole
Just
podcast.
on
Yeah,
that's a whole podcast.
we'll get some folks for that. But like, if we're human beings, we bring certain things that are fun about us. We bring certain levels of identity that we have with us. We bring a vision and a passion in certain things. We need to do more of that. We need to do more of that bringing of that. We need to do more of stepping back in the middle of crises and saying, how is everybody responding to their own crisis of this? And I appreciate your application of religion and spirituality as being critical. because it is one of those things where, as somebody who has worked on college campuses around this subject matter, like people are told over and over again, we can't talk about our religion and spirituality, but it is a driving piece of everyone's identity. And if you are sitting here and going, I'm not religious, you're not religious in a reaction to a historical like framework of mostly Western Protestant Christian. And that's fine. You should have safety to do that. And if you are coming from certain religious traditions, you should be safety in that. But that, when we don't tell our authentic stories, we can't solve authentic crises. We can't solve authentically complex issues. We can't be authentic leaders because we're not allowing our whole selves to show up. We are such and such vice dean of diversity, equity, inclusion, and our whole job is to fill that role. Well, Tomika, you are more than just the title of your job.
You know, for some people, though, I mean, let's be honest, when we were doc students, our identity as a doc student permeated everything. And so I always think about, I was having a conversation with one of my advisees this morning, and I was talking about where are the asset based, the anti-deficit parts of your work. Like, how are you being your authentic self? How can you make it easier to name the joy in what you do than the barriers? And what she helped me understand, in relation to that you are more than just your title, is that at times there are seasons where the title and the work that we're doing is so central to everything that it becomes hard to disentangle that. And there has to be a pathway, a transition. There has to be something that disrupts that idea, that, that danger of a single story concept, which is one of my favorite TED Talks. So, as we get to the end of our talk, I think that that's a really good lens to maybe think about actionable strategies. So we've been able to talk really about the theory to practice and practice to theory, which I think the practice to theory piece is something that could be more investigated, and that we can really start having the infusion purposefully of practitioners in scholarship so that we can make sure that we're learning from what administrators are doing and not just what students say and not just what people might think, right? I think that that's an area that I've seen growth in a little bit more in athletic literature. From a sports management perspective, I think we see it in counseling and psychology a lot. So there are pockets where that's happening. But when we start to think about getting people to be more authentic, to take ownership of all of their identities and the complexity of being authentic, what might be one or two actionable strategies that you would share with folks, particularly leaders and people who identify as leaders, to have a more sustainable approach so that it's not leading to burnout, it's not leading to a lack of authenticity, but it's leading to a more holistic and healthy understanding of who they are?
I mean, I think on the practical level, like in terms of supervision levels, it's got to be much more of this sort of like checking in on the individual. And I think like very easily, like building team meetings, building retreats, building one-on-ones to have a more authentic, like, how are you kind of thing. And to recognize that that trust that you may or may not have is not just given, it has to be earned. So you're going to have to show up in those ways over time for people to trust that they actually want to know you. And you're going to have to recognize that people have come from different perspectives, different willingnesses in general to be revealing, vulnerable, all of that stuff that you're going to have to model yourself, but also, sort of think about as a future unfolds within whatever organization that you're in. I think the second one is really being intentional about adding restorative practices into your work and to really think about a restorative lens where it's not just a restorative circle, but about really thinking about how the application of restorative work can be a 360 sort of flattening of your structure, how you can get feedback from colleagues and those that you supervise. I think all of those things are really, really important. So what would you add to that?
I think that I would say it's not about what you've learned. It's not about your title. It's really about, do you love yourself? some of the most phenomenal leaders I have met, and I think about when we talked with Kevin McDonald, I think when we talked to I think everybody we've talked to, but I think Kevin's interview stands out the most to me, is how he made so many personal sacrifices to make sure that he created space for his professional growth and self without sacrificing it, right? So to me, it's like when you love yourself, it you lead differently. And so I would first encourage, like, do you love yourself? But if not, do the things that would take you on a journey to self-love, because it's really hard to be great and excellent for a sustained period of time, either as a leader, a professional, or even as a parent, without having that skill to where you trust and love yourself. The second thing I would say I'm entering my 5th year as an assistant dean. I think it's being okay if your professional journey doesn't reflect the people who you might role model or look up to. I don't know too many people who have hybrid positions while trying to pursue tenure. And, to be honest, there are many times where I feel like people question me based on their understanding of what they think my role should be or what it might feel like. And so I found myself in the past being very defensive and over explaining myself. I've walked away from that because I have come at peace with the challenge and I'm okay with it. And so I'm okay that my journey looks different. And because of that, it's freeing. It's liberating. It gives me a level of care for myself and grace, or compassion, whatever term works best, that I can breathe a little bit more when I have to adjust my own goals and my priorities for myself. And that's a space that I encourage everyone to be in. Your journey is your own. I'm not trying to replicate the people who I look up to, because I don't know what they had to sacrifice behind closed doors and the decisions that they've had to make that to get there. But I'm okay with learning from their experiences and gleaning what's necessary, while also taking what works for me, right? I guess that's the innovative part of my journey. Um, but Cody, I I've enjoyed this conversation of being able to be reflective about how we got here, but also in a way that I feel is authentic. That leadership is messy, but it requires a lot of reflection, and it requires us taking ownership of our journeys and the multitude of our identities and being okay with the fact that it's not for everyone and it's different for everyone.
Yeah, no, I agree. And also, I just want to say to our listeners, I think Tomika had the better answer here on these two of the what to do. Now I'm sitting over here reflecting, being like, yeah, love yourself, like be on your own individual journey. I'm like, wow, I should have answered more like that. Well, this is fun. I've really enjoyed this. I've enjoyed this, the beginnings of this series with you. And we hope you, the listeners, have also really enjoyed the 5 parts with us. And obviously, we hope that we will be talking to you soon with more guests and with many more conversations around leadership and about equity and inclusion as a sort of lens within what we do, and also just thinking through like situations and crises as a pathway for us to think about a shared future of this field of higher education.
This Pulse Check mini-series has been brought to you by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.